Welcome back to the Pilot Network Podcast. I'm Matt, co-founder of the Pilot Network and your co-host for today's show. Today, we're continuing with part 2 of an amazing interview with TPN's oldest member, Bill Braxton. If you haven't listened to part 1 of this interview yet, go back and listen to episode number 11. You don't want to miss any of it.
And we ended up at Waycross, Georgia, and I had about, I guess maybe 100, 110 hours or so. We got 120 hours flying time in the P-40.
Oh, wow.
But I had the misfortune of going to Sapelo Island on gunnery training, and I made a pass on the target, pulled up. We're about 11,000 feet out over the water, and the engine quit.
Oh, no.
Scared the hell out of me. It backfired and started up, and then it would kick off and on. We had an instructor pilot with us. He was flying right beside me. And he says, well, we better head to the shore. At least you have land on the beach or something. So turned over to Sapelo Island, which happened to be right there off the coast of Savannah. And I was up at 11,000 feet, and they tried to get it started. It would backfire. But pretty soon, smoke began to fill up the cockpit, and then the fire around my feet. And I told the pilot, I said, should I bail out? He says, use your judgment. It's not my problem. So I was maybe 3,000 feet, and I hopped out and ended up on Sapelo Island.
Oh, wow.
And when I got back to the base, the ops officer says, Lieutenant, I don't know if you know it, but if we have anybody bail out, they transfer you to another outfit into some other system. Like it was my fault. I didn't have anything to do with it.
Right.
So he says, well, we've got 2 or 3 jobs, and you've been an administrative man for years, way back when as an enlisted man. He says, we need you to be a commanding officer of a POW camp, a German POW camp, in the Okefenokee Swamp up here south of Savannah.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a really good job. He says, and you got a BT-13, a basic trainer airplane. Says, it's yours to do whatever you want to, but fly. You better get at least 20 or 30 hours every month. So it was a real good job. And of course, I got the whole city of Waycross, Georgia here, and I'm permanent, so there were nothing but girls. Every place you look were and but I stayed, I guess, about 6 or 7 months. And the last connection I had with Colonel Blair, I wrote him a letter and says, yeah, I'm stuck here. I'd like to get overseas before the war's over. This was, of course, 1944 and early 45. And he said, well, I'll see what I can do. I'll let you know in a couple of days. What do you want to do? I said, I don't know. I just want to get out of this. But I still want to keep on flying. I liked flying then.
Sure.
And, of course, I'm flying maybe 20 hours a month in the BT-13. And he called me a couple of days later, says, I talked to a friend of mine, and he says, we've got vacancies in the ferry command of the Air Transport Command. And that was a worldwide thing. And I said, well, what do I do with that? He says, you ferry airplanes. And I said, that sounds good to me, but not here at Waycross. He says, no, you've been transferred to Romulus, Michigan. That was the Ford plant.
Mm-hmm.
And the Ford was making B-24s at the time.
Sure.
And I thought, God, I'm going to be flying B-24s. But when I got up to Romulus, Michigan, right outside of Detroit, our base was part of the factory making the B-24s.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the base ops captain who had been overseas took me out in a C-47 into Gooneyburg.
Sure.
And first thing he did when he got off the ground, I said, I never been in an airplane like this. I said, I've been flying single engine. He says, okay. He cuts the engine. What it is, goddamn Goonie bird. We're up about 4,000 feet, and he just feathered one engine. And didn't put his feet down on the rudders or anything. So we make a big circle. He said, is this like a fighter plane? I said, no, not quite. But anyway, they checked me out in the C-47, and for the next 3 years, that's what I flew. The base was closing, the war was over, and the base was closing, and the Air Force was discharging people like crazy. And the base commander called me in. He said, Braxton, do you know somebody in Washington? I said, no. I said, I know a lot of people. I used to work there, but I said, I don't know anybody particular. I didn't want to say anything about Colonel Blair but they transferred me to the Air Transport Command headquarters at Bowling Field. Not Bowling Field. At that time we had the headquarters for the Air Transport Command was at National Airport. So we had National Airport buildings all over the place, temporary buildings and so on. And they put me in the operations division there. By this time I was made captain.
Okay.
They had a 3-star general running in fact, one of my books there, General George, he came in my office for something someday. He says, are you a pilot? I says, well, I'm wearing my wings. He says, who the hell are you? What are you doing in a personnel job? I said, well, this is where they put me. He says, you come with me. I need a co-pilot. So he had a C-45.
Okay.
What is that? Twin engine thing. Anyway, he says, I need somebody. I just fly locally. I don't fly all over. He made trips all over the world, but with a big airplane.
Sure.
But when he was flying locally, he had to have a co-pilot. And so he hauled me around. He says, you know something? He says, your name sounds familiar to me. And I said, well, I've been in the Air Force a long, 6-7 years.
Right.
But I said, I was at Langley Field. He says, yeah, so was I. I remember you as a court reporter at Langley. So anyway, by this time, he was a major general and then later on a 3-star. But he says, you know how you got here? He says, I have a friend named Cyrus Blair, a colonel over the Pentagon. He says, he called me, and that's how we got you transferred to the Air Transport Command.
Looking out for you the whole time, huh?
Yeah. About this time, I met this girl I'd been at a skating rink or something. Anyway, I came out of the skating rink. There's a bus sitting there, and there was no driver. He was out having a cigarette, and I got up on the bus because of where I wanted to go, and there was this girl there, nobody else on the bus. And I, like a good fighter pilot, sat down beside, can I sit with you? Sure, she said. And I said, how would you like to get married? She says, you are a nut. She says, yeah, I'll marry you. When? I said, maybe tomorrow morning. Oh, she says, I live with my parents. I'd have to tell my mother and my father. And so she says, you stay on the bus with me. And we went home and told her parents. Next morning, we went and got a wedding license.
Oh, wow.
A week later, we were married.
Wow.
And then I came back to headquarters, and the general, his name General George, Harold George. Anyway, General George came into my desk one day. He says, hey, I hear you got married. And he says, you've never been overseas? I said, yes, sir, I've been to Panama. He says, hell, that ain't overseas. That's a country club place. He says, I mean, where they're fighting the war, or we're fighting the war. The war was over. It was 46, early 46. And he said, I have to do something. I have to get you something. But sir, you don't have to do that. Yeah, he says, I have to do. Next day, he come by, and he's got an envelope. And he says, I got some new orders for you. You have to go overseas. But he says, your wife can go with you. And I says, where? He says, Paris. I'm assigned to Paris.
Hardship tour,
Real
right?
hardship tour. And, of course, I went home, told my wife, she was tickled to death with her. The idea of spending a honeymoon in Paris.
Right.
Plus the next couple of years, too. Anyway, I got to Paris. And I flew to Paris on the Air Force One. Was C-54. At that time, it was called a Sacred Cow.
Mm-hmm.
It was Harry Truman's plane.
Sure.
But ATC used it for anything. So they were using it. When he wasn't using it, they were flying a regular route with it. And next day, I'm in Paris, sitting in Paris, living it up. Boy, put us in the fanciest hotel in Paris. Of course, the Army of Occupation took over everything.
Mm-hmm.
And they put me in base ops for a while. I didn't do anything but sit around because there were so many officers. The war was over. We had officers by the thousands.
Sure.
And I stayed there for about 2 or 3 months, didn't do anything. And I finally went in to the personnel officer and asked, what am I doing here? He says, well, we're looking for a place to put you. And I said, I thought I could stay right here. He says, no, they're going to close down Paris.
Mm-hmm.
They're moving the headquarters to Wiesbaden. And he says, you don't want to go to Wiesbaden. Nobody wants to go to Wiesbaden. And he says, well, told a couple of days later, he says, you have your choice of 2 of our bases, either Rome or Vienna.
Two more hardship tours, I guess.
Really hardship tour. And Peggy was still in Washington. She had to wait a couple of months to get orders to come over. So I went down and talked to some of the pilots who were flying around Europe at the time and asked them. They said, man, don't go to Rome. They're getting ready to close Rome. He says, Vienna is one of the best spots in Europe. He says, what's so good about it? He says, it's away from everything else. And he says, you fly Goonie birds. That's all they had. And
which you were already familiar with.
Yeah, I'd already checked out in them and everything. So I get to Vienna 3 or 4 days later and told Peggy, she's still on orders to go to Paris. And here we are going to Vienna. And of course, the Army, our job at Vienna, the Tulen Air Base, was in the Russian zone, behind the Russian lines.
Mm-hmm.
The Russians Vienna was like Berlin, was a 4-power city.
Sure.
The French, the Germans, and that. So the Russians had given each country, because they had charge of the whole thing, they gave us all our own airfield. So the American Air Force was down on the Danube River about maybe 15 miles out of Vienna. And I sat there for 2.5 years. It's one of the best, well, it was the best assignment I ever had in the Air Force.
Sure.
Because I flew Goonie birds. And I went there as a pilot, and that's what supposed to be my job. As soon as I got there, the base commander called me in. He says, hey, he says, I hear you've been in personnel and working sergeant major. And he says, we need a base adjutant. I said, Colonel, I want to fly. He says, you can fly anytime you want to. He was one of the old timers in the Air Force.
Sure.
And sure enough, a couple of days later, I got a call, and we were going to Bucharest, Romania.
Uh-huh.
And for the next 2 years, at least once a week, I either went to Prague or to Belgrade. What we did was supply the missions, the American missions, in each one of these places.
So you'd fly the Goonie bird into each one of those?
And the Goonie bird was that. And a lot of instrument flying, because in the wintertime especially, was cloudy all the time. But it wasn't bad. It was smooth instrument flying. And I didn't know anything about instruments. I'd never been in a cloud.
Were you instrument rated?
Yeah, but I, of course, flew as a co-pilot for a while.
Okay.
And
so you were not yet instrument rated in the airplane?
No, not. Well, you had to, even as just a pilot out of flying school, you had what we call a white instrument card, which later becomes a green instrument card where you could sign your own clearance and all that.
Sure.
And I'm flying, and we had to do, every pilot, they came out with this 100 hours a month. You had to have 100 hours. You had to fly 4 hours to get paid, but you had to do at least 100 hours and 10 hours of actual instruments and all this kind of stuff. Was sometimes a hard job back here in the States to meet these requirements. Over there, it was a joke. We made those requirements the first month.
Right.
And was really good. They had some good assignments. One of the assignments I had from Langley Field, there was a guy named Harold Stassen, ran for president. He had been the governor of Minnesota. And he ran, it was 1948, I guess. He was running for president again, and he was making a world tour, and he ended up in Vienna with orders to go on to Belgrade, Yugoslavia, and then into Russia.
Sure.
To see Joe Stalin, I guess, was still around.
Right.
And I was picked as one of the pilots to go. And I said, man, I didn't know Harold Stassen. I knew who he was. And as soon as we got off the ground, he came up to the front and he says, can I sit up here? Sure, I gave him my seat, tickled to death to let him sit. And he sat there for about, I guess, half an hour or so. Anyway, we went on to Belgrade, Yugoslavia, and they rolled out the red carpet for us because of this big political figure.
Sure.
And the Yugoslav Air Force, Marshal Tito was the head, and he was out there to meet everybody. And they turned us, the crew members, over, and Stassen says, you guys be back here in 5 days. Says, we're going on to Russia. I said, well, that's all right with me. I don't care where I go. And we were royally entertained by the Yugoslav Air Force with everything, including women.
Yeah.
Nightclub every night and all of this. So at the end of 5 days, we get a note, got to wait another 2 or 3 days. And a couple of days later, we got orders that he's going to ride on a train. Marshal Tito has offered him his private plane, private train, to go by rail on to Russia. So Stassen thanked us, and the Air Force guys loaded our airplane down with something called Slivovitz. So naturally alcoholic.
Sure.
So we took that back to our officers' club. In Vienna, we had a hard time getting anything alcoholic.
Right.
Supplies were getting pretty low. And by 1940...
And you come back with a Goonie bird full of it, huh?
Yeah. And, when my tour was up, Peggy, and at that time we had a son, and my wife was pregnant again, and she went home to Washington. No, we went together back to Washington, but I had orders to go to Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas.
I've heard of it.
It's the headquarters for the fighter business, the Thunderbirds and all that.
Yep, I spent quite a bit of time there myself.
Gunnery meets and all that. What the hell am I doing? Somebody had looked at my record and says, you were a fighter pilot. We were going to put you back in fighters. So, but when I get to Nellis, they had nothing but P-51s. Just the whole field everywhere. Well, when I went through flying school with the P-40s, we checked out in the 51. I think I had maybe 20 or 30 hours or something. So anyway, I'm here at Nellis, and right after report to the base commander, and I said, well, you can assign me to base ops. He says, I'm assigning you to that seat right there. You're my base adjutant.
Can't get away from it.
That administrative thing followed me all the way up until the time I retired, because I came back when I ended up from Nellis. I went back. Somebody in Washington saw my name, and they hauled me into personnel. The Korean War had just started, and they needed officers in personnel. where my name popped up and back there. So I go back, and I ended up in the National Guard Bureau with assigned to the Air National Guard.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, when the Korean War started, they called up every National Guard unit to active duty. And my job, they put me in, they said, well, you're an assistant ops officer, but your job is to go around all over the country, visit each unit, and make sure their records, personnel records and everything, are up to date and ready to be on active duty. So for 4 years, and I said, well, how do I do all this? I'm going to fly commercial. Oh, no, we got a C-45 just waiting for you. So I had my own airplane in the Pentagon,
Nice.
which was unheard. Most guys in the Pentagon don't get 4 hours a month,
Right.
but I was getting 50, 60 hours a month.
And you were just flying everywhere yourself.
Well, and had my own airplane, could go anytime I wanted to, and could pick out a place I wanted to go, if it was Boston or Dayton or wherever.
Sure.
So I spent all my time. And one of the good things about this, when I was in Vienna, since we were flying Goonie birds, and most of the pilots had very little instrument experience, and they set up an instrument school in Munich, Germany.
Sure.
And each base would get a quota every 2 months. And I went to the base commander. I says, base commander was getting orders to go back to the States. He said, what do I care? You go where you want to. And he says, the next quota that comes in, your name is on it. So I went to the instrument school. And for 2 months, we did nothing but fly instruments. We needle ball and airspeed all the time. And you got to where you could hold when you got enough practice, when you're doing this 6, 8, 10 hours a day, it gets pretty old hat.
Get
So
pretty good
when
at
I got back to the Pentagon to fly the C-45, I didn't care what the weather was. I'd go anywhere.
Right.
And I did that for, the 4 years. And Curtis LeMay was there. He was the chief of staff. And he came out with an order, if you hadn't been in combat, you had to go to Korea. And so here I am, Korea, and instead of flying the combat missions, I got over there and the war was almost over, and I went into a C-119 outfit. You know what a 119 flying boxcar. And of course I had flown twin engine now, so I was all right for that. And I was squadron ops of one of the main things. I hadn't been there a month because somebody told me, says, hey, the French are fighting a Dien Bien Phu down in thing, and we're going to get into this. Eisenhower's making up his mind now. Well, we got all the airplanes, and we hiked down to the Philippines with my whole squadron, about 16, 18 airplanes. And we get to the Philippines, somebody came on my airplane and says, don't even cut your engines off. So as soon as we get your plane loaded, you're going to Dien Bien Phu. You're going to Hanoi. And it didn't make any difference to me. It's another place,
Sure.
So sure enough, off we go to the Philippines and loaded up with ammunition and stuff for the French. And we went over to Hanoi, and they give us a French co-pilot or observer, actually, who would tell us where to drop the stuff. And we'd go drop the stuff and then come back to Hanoi and then back. And the way they got around, the president was saying back here in the States, we don't have anybody over there. None, and we're not going to get involved in that.
Right.
The first time I landed in Hanoi, there must have been at least 50 C-119s sitting. Every one of them flying every day to the airport, Dien Bien Phu. That was a crazy situation. The communists, most of the time, didn't even fire on us because the supplies we were dropping by parachute would drift over to their lines. Mm-hmm. So we were supplying the communists as well as the French, too. And Eisenhower finally made the decision that we weren't going to be there. Oh, I know. One of our planes got shot down and an American crew on board. And because of the publicity, and Eisenhower was the president, he decided we should get out of there. So they pulled us all out all at once.
Oh, well.
I get back, okay, I'm close to 20 years. I'm ready to go back to the States. Before I left the States, I had arranged with the personnel officer at SAC to go into the B-47 program. I wanted to come to Florida, and Orlando was the spot so I had orders and everything all set. I get to California on my way back to go to Orlando. Here, my orders, somebody called me in, your orders have been changed. Says, you are ordered to the FBI headquarters, report to J. Edgar Hoover. Scared the hell out of me. I thought I had done something somewhere along, because I'd been top secret officer all during the Korean War. Sure. And handled all the top secret material. Anyway, I hike up to Washington. I dress up with a fancy uniform and all that.
Right.
I go over to the FBI headquarters. Everybody's looking at me. What the hell? Military. What are you doing in here? I don't know. My orders say report to Mr. Hoover. I walked in the door, and Hoover was behind his desk, and there were about 10 men, looked like about my age, sitting around the place in civilian clothes.
Were you a major at this time?
Yeah, I was a major, just before I made lieutenant colonel.
Sure.
Anyway, Hoover, the first thing he said, who the hell are you? I told him, well, Major Braxton. He said, what do you do in a uniform? Hoover says, you are now under me. You are no longer an officer. Wait a minute now. I'm still an officer. He says, yeah, he told us, you're still an officer. I said, I'm a pilot. What about my flying? He said, that's your problem. When you get to the base, you have to arrange flying. Sure. And I ended up at Otis Air Force Base, Cape Cod. Okay. That's one of for a last assignment, that was the best deal I could have gotten.
Yeah, working for the FBI?
Yeah, and I reported there to an FBI agent, local FBI agent, and he and I got along real fine.
Sure.
The very first thing when I got there, he says, let's go to the club and have a drink. I said, this is the middle of the day. He says, I don't care. He says, you're in civilian clothes, nobody's going to bother you.
What were you doing for that job?
At Otis, I was a detachment commander, but nobody knew that I was reporting to the FBI. I was in OSI.
Okay.
And our job was to find out if there were any officers who were communists and or any soldiers either. I spent almost 4 years there and flying like crazy. It was the very first thing that happened. Base ops called me and says, hey, you got a C-119? You can fly 119. He says, we got 3 brand new ones, and nobody on the base has ever flown them but you. And they got me then.
So you had your own airplane again.
Yeah, that was my own airplane. And basically, pretty much that was Air Defense Command at that time. And our job at Otis with the 119s was to go around the country and take the fighter squadrons out to Yuma, Arizona for gunnery training. Okay. And we were free for a week. It took a week to go to get everybody and get them out to Yuma. And my pilot and I, the very first time we were there, here it is. He says, it's Friday afternoon, and we don't have to go back home. They tell us, come back next week, Monday or Tuesday. So I looked at the map. Here's the first thing that I saw was Las Vegas, right? Sure. The closest space to Yuma. So we went to Las Vegas for 3 days. And after that, we'd go out at least once a month to Yuma and then on up to Las Vegas.
What was Las Vegas like back then?
Oh, with Las Vegas, when I came back from Europe, was something because the Strip wasn't there. There was the Desert Inn. I think the Mafia were running 2 or 3 big motels. And that's the only thing that was out on the Strip. Most of the gambling was downtown. Golden Nugget was the big place. But the very first time we went to Las Vegas, the first night we went in a nightclub, and of course they had Louis Prima and the orchestra from the 30s and 40s.
Sure.
In those days, they didn't have a closed floor show. The floor show was part of the slot machines and all around.
Sure.
Everywhere. And they had the entertainment up on a stage right in the middle of the slot machines and everything. So we sat down. It was an empty thing there. Bill Potter, and was a good friend of mine. And he and I sat down in the front row. And here come, of course, Frank Sinatra and all the gamblers, the big gamblers from Hollywood.